Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I'm very happy to be here, very delighted to be here, and to share a little bit about the work that we are doing. So through the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program, with a myriad of partners across the world, but I'll be focusing on our work within Asia and the Pacific, and a little bit about what we've been learning at the intersection of wildlife, human, and livestock interfaces, and how we can take that to try and create win-win scenarios, not only for health outcomes, but for conservation and for people. So I'll go through some of the challenges, the opportunities, and through some of the field practices and models that we've seen yield results within the region. A little bit of context that I think most of you will be familiar with. So within this region, we have about 70% of the world's remaining biodiversity hotspots, primary forests that are virtually untouched within the region. Within this region, we also have hundreds of millions of people that rely on forests for their food and livelihoods. And within that, wildlife-dependent communities are especially reliant on these sources for their food security, their nutrition, their income, and their cultural identity. And those interfaces also present significant risks for zoonotic outcomes, especially now that we're finding with climate change and with habitat fragmentation, these interfaces are more and more compressed. Humans, wildlife, livestock come more and more contacts with each other. Opportunities for disease transmission are more and more frequent. And we've seen that within spillover events in the past 20, 30 years or so, most recently COVID-19, but also the Nipah outbreak that's been announced earlier this year in India. Most of you will be familiar with that. But so all that to say that Asia and the Pacific really sits at that intersection when we talk about health, biodiversity, and people. This is really the most relevant region we need to be talking about. And as I'll go into more detail later, there's still some significant gaps we're unable to address because there's so much we still don't know. So this is a little bit of a complex diagram, but I want to talk about the values that we derive from wildlife. Most of us use wild food and plants and animals on nearly a daily basis, whether we realize to or not. This use can be either consumptive, so you might have exotic pets in your home. You might be eating wild meat, or you might be consuming wild plants. You might be using medicines, traditional medicines. You may have wildlife as part of traditional spiritual uses. You might also not be using wildlife in a consumptive way, taking a walk in the park, driving to a nearby national park. Maybe you're into bird watching, something like that. And even if you're not interacting with wildlife in one way or another, you still depend on it because wildlife, plants, animals provide essential ecosystem services to the water we drink, the air we breathe, and our agriculture and the food that we eat. And so all of these benefits are interwoven with modern societies, whether they're rural or urban. Beyond benefits, however, there are several costs or trade-offs of living either in close contact or interacting with wildlife. One of it is disease transmission, as we well know, but there are also hundreds of millions of people across the world that suffer from what we call human-wildlife conflicts. Crop damage, livestock predation from tigers, from panthers, leopards, depending on where you are. Elephants are a huge issue within Southeast Asia alone. And many of you, either you've lived in rural areas or you have family or friends who've been affected. This is a daily reality, and especially rural communities bear the costs of this interaction and this coexistence with wildlife. So when we look at wildlife management as a system, we need to be cognizant of both how people use wildlife and benefit from it, but also how they might suffer from their coexistence with wildlife, and how those interactions change as habitats become more and more degraded as land use changes or as climate change drives people and wildlife into closer contact with each other. And so all of this needs to be understood and balanced as we take management actions. But it's easier said than done because, as you see on the screen, it's a very complex systems. So within this region, I want to go back to some of the most recent research that's been looking at this sort of interaction between human, wildlife, and environment dimensions, and some of the key challenges that have been identified, mainly on four areas. We have governance and policy gaps. We see that whether it's within countries or across countries, mandates across health, forestry, wildlife conservation, and agriculture are not aligned. Legislations are not aligned. And so sometimes we see either inconsistencies between national legislation that lead to a lack of understanding or enforcement. Or we see outright contradictions because ministries and departments are not necessarily talking to each other. And this is not unique to Asia or the Pacific. This is across the world, but it's a huge barrier to actually having mandates that are clear and, authorities that are given this mandate to be able to enforce legislation properly, but also understanding of what the rules and regulations are at the local level. We have huge socioeconomic pressure, as I described earlier on. People relying on wildlife either as for food security or for income. We don't really understand how gender roles play a role into this. There's still a lot of knowledge and data gaps. So we don't actually know much about baseline populations, what is a sustainable or minimum viable population. So we don't really know how much we can extract, whether it's wild plants or wild animals. What is a sustainable limit? If we're talking about, communities going into the forest to get some firewood, or collecting some mushrooms, or going to hunt small game for meat. There's very little data on what a sustainable quota or offtake might be. And so that's a huge impediment to sustainable use. Beyond that, we just don't really understand much about the human-wildlife-livestock interface and the disease risks and how this flows, although that's been more and more researched in the past 15 years. There's still much that we don't know. And we have compounding ecological threats, deforestation that remains high within much of this region, climate change, and other threats like invasive species, habitat loss, that further drives biodiversity decline and further drives it into close contact with humans at those interfaces, at the interface between protected areas and agricultural or urban landscapes. Despite these key challenges, we do have several windows of opportunities that we should seize. In the past few years, we've seen, especially post-COVID, international policy frameworks focus on green recovery. We have the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the treaties for the high seas that was voted last year. Several international commitments that countries have signed up to, and they then translate and adapt these into their national action plans to translate these commitments at national level. And what does that mean? We've seen across much of the world a drive on co-management models, recognizing that communities and indigenous peoples have a bigger role to play. For decades, that wasn't the case, and it was, top-down fortress conservation, and we weren't listening to local voices, voiced indigenous people that had a lot of traditional ecological knowledge. We're starting to see a shift in this, and more as we test these models, as we refine them, we see that they're really, first of all, well adapted to local realities, but they're also just and sustainable, because once local communities, once they get given the agency for managing natural resources and wildlife, we see a real drive and a real change. Several technological innovations that arose in the last few years, whether that's through satellite imagery, eDNA, or several advances in artificial intelligence that are getting applied throughout the field. One Health, more and more we're talking about One Health, and we're seeing it operationalized in action. Sectors talking to each other, different stakeholders having these conversations and trying to form coordination, whether it's at national or subnational level, and that's a real drive in intersectoral coordination that can drive real change. And within our region, we also have very diversified livelihood pathways, anywhere from ecotourism to non-timber forest products, several value chains that we're seeing exploited across the region, from cocoa, coffee, palm oil, etc. There's more and more attention on how we turn those into more sustainable value chains and drive greater returns to local communities and smallholders, and other agriculture and nature-friendly value chains. So now I want to talk a little bit about, after the scene setting, I want to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing. And we focus particularly on one commodity that we feel is still widely under-researched in this region, but represents a good opportunity to look at these interfaces and to derive management action for wildlife conservation. And that commodity is wild meat. As I mentioned earlier, communities all across this region consume wildlife. Many of them consume wildlife for meat, and this wild meat can be essential to food security and nutrition. So within the work that we do under the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program, you see on the map below here that we're working all across the world. Most of our sites since the last 10 years have been in Africa, but recently we've expanded into Asia and the Pacific, specifically looking at three things. Trying to ensure sustainable use of wildlife by communities while ensuring that their essential needs are being met. So food security, livelihoods, etc. Is that use sustainable? How can it be made sustainable in a way that doesn't drive further trade-offs for already impoverished communities, but instead create opportunities? That can be done through increasing sustainable domestic animal production, or it can also be done through other ways that I'll go into later. And we also look into, as part of this picture, how we can mitigate zoonotic risks within wildlife-based value chains. So we started this exercise by looking a little bit at what do we know about wild meat in the region. And spoiler alert, we don't know much. We did a bit of a systematic review. So you see a map here of Southeast Asia in particular. We didn't find any wild meat literature that fit our criteria within the Pacific. So no literature looking at how consumption is related to food security, nutrition, livelihoods, or health. However, we see quite a lot of research being done in Indonesia and Laos and Vietnam. We see most of that research is qualitative in nature. And although there is some investigation into why wild meat is used and what other uses there are, we don't really know much about the external drivers of this. Is it poverty? Is it preference for taste? Is it something else? The research doesn't really go that deep in general. And there's also little research into the specific health risks or how the management of these different management practices reduce these risks. So I'll pull up two graphs from that research that is we're trying to publish later this year. So this is a preliminary view of the findings. Currently, we see that most publications really look into the interventions at national level on law enforcement and national policy. There's very little information of how monitoring of wild meat consumption is being done, and in general, very little information on how interventions are work or do not work. There's little evaluation of interventions within this region, and so we don't really know what works and what doesn't. We looked at the drivers of wild meat use, and we started seeing some common trends. So unsurprisingly, food, income, and traditional medicines were being the major drivers in the literature that we reviewed. We started to identify some external drivers and non-use drivers, but these are way less mentioned in the literature. So all in all, that picture tells us that we really don't know much. There's a lot of piecemeal research being done here and there on very specific sites, but at regional level, there's very little that we do know. And so there's very little actionable evidence that governments can use or that other stakeholders can use to say, okay, right, in my country or in my sub-region, what do I do about this? How important is this issue? We simply don't know. And so I want to take you to the way we look at this in other countries and what we're doing to address this in Asia and the Pacific under the program. This is a typical wild meat value chain, so going from the farm or the forest all the way to the fork. And the way we try and look at this to better understand these dynamics is we do diagnostic. So either through value chain analyses and risk assessments, looking at specific pathogens, and we look at consumption studies. So we try and understand what is the reliance on food security, protein security, what other uses of wildlife are there, where is that flowing to, is that local, is that going to the cities, etc. Within the situational analysis, you first do a mapping of wild meat value chains. You try and understand who is doing the hunting, who is doing the selling, who is doing the consuming, when is that happening, where, what are the drivers, what are the practices around this. All of that is important qualitative information to better understand what we are looking at. We have a variety of ways we do that. So looking at biodiversity assessments, risk assessments at priority nodes in the value chain where wildlife come into close contact with each other, whether alive or dead. We analyze rural consumption patterns and how rural communities depend on wild meat. And then we look at urban consumption patterns, which tend to be more of a preference-driven demand. In Lao PDR, we've done this work and we've looked at in northeastern Laos, we've looked at different villages, and we went around and tried to do this mapping. So this is data from last year where we went and did qualitative surveys. We followed up this year with quantitative surveys, but the results aren't ready yet for me to share. But this should give you a little bit of an understanding, who is doing the hunting. So we see here, it's mostly young males. They hunt in groups. They go from 1 to 3 times a month. The main motivation tends to be for food security, domestic consumption at the household level. And if they sometimes catch a more valuable species, they tend to sell it on the market because they know it can bring in more money. But that doesn't tend to be the primary motivation for hunting. It's more of an opportunistic, they'll lay a trap in the forest, and if they catch something that's worth a little bit of money, then they go and sell it. We see that species that are being hunted are mostly low-value species, common species like wild boar, deer. Sometimes they catch civets, which they tend to sell, but also wild chickens, jungle fowl, squirrels, and bamboo rats. And we've seen since COVID-19 an increase in direct sales online. So either through WhatsApp group, Facebook, now on TikTok as well. And that makes it much more difficult to track and to analyze the risk of disease transmission because we don't understand. It's moving into a very online e-commerce space, which we struggle to understand then the practices and how that translates into more risk or not. I think for the sake of time, I will skip the next slides, but I believe that you'll find those online later. I just want to say, let me just go to the end of my presentation. You'll find further reading and resources. This year we'll launch a series of webinars on around wild meat. So if you are interested in learning a little bit more, this is specifically targeted for Asia and the Pacific. So we'll be, talking with scientists, policymakers, practitioners from around the region, and looking into this into a lot more detail and how that translates into effective management. So if you're interested, please, you're very welcome to join that when that eventually launches. We're thinking in the next month or so. But I hope that this was useful and very happy to answer any questions in the panel discussion later. Thank you very much.